welcome to or welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me here again today. I hope everyone is safe and doing very well. So last week we spoke about cop killers, and that was the Leslie Cilliers case. So if you haven't seen that, I will link it up here for you. But today we are going to flip the switch, and today we are going to talk about a man who did indeed kill some cops. However, he would also confuse the South African police services for quite some time because he was not a person to stick to a typical MO. And I guess you could argue that these types of serial killers are some of the worst types because you never know what to expect and you never know what they're going to do next. But for today's case, we are going to talk about the serial killer named David Mmbengwa. And before we hop into this case, I do just want to say that unfortunately I had no photos of the serial killer that I could positively identify as David. So with that being said and enough rambling from me, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
David Mmbengwa was born on the 10th of October 1966. And David was born in Limpopo. David was one of 7 children, and sadly David's mom and dad really struggled to put food on the table. There were a lot of mouths to feed and they weren't offered high-paying jobs at all. Remember, this was the middle of apartheid in South Africa. And then sadly, when David was quite young, his father ended up passing away. And after David's father had then passed away, all of his siblings then had to step up, and they either had to work in and around the house or they had to try and get some kind of income the best they could. But most of the children would spend most of their time working in and outside the house. But soon after David's father had also passed away, David's mom remarried another man. David's upbringing was not very loving, it was not very warm. He actually had a very cold upbringing, and his relationship with his father before his father had passed on was very tumultuous and very cold. David's father wouldn't really pay much attention to David at all. But besides David and his father's relationship, David would also witness his mom having affairs with other men, and he would walk into his mother sleeping with other men or doing other things, and this was a common occurrence. David's mom was also not very present in David's life at all. She would not really spend much time with any of her children. She would try and nurture them as much as she could, but this type of attention was very far and few between. So as a child, with David seeing his mom have all these marital affairs, this obviously had an outstanding effect on his upbringing and his development. And as an adult, psychologists would later say that this type of experience and what David had seen had a much deeper effect on his psyche as well. They would say that when David would watch his mom sleep with other men, it kind of changed the way that he viewed his mother as well. And instead of being a mother figure and someone like that who he had a relationship with, so what David would now see his mother as was rather more an object than a person. And he would see these men constantly using his mother, and this would really anger him. David would only end up finishing grade 7, and he did not attend high school with any of his friends. And because David didn't go to high school, he had a lot of free time, and he would either help out around the house or he would try and keep himself busy. But for a 13 or 14-year-old at the time, this really didn't last long, and he then ended up going to the streets to try and find something to do, to try and find some friends, or just something to keep his mind and body occupied. And so David did, and he did end up going around the streets, but he found more than friends and something to do. He kind of found trouble. And by the time David was 20 was the first time he was actually arrested, and David was then charged for his crimes and sentenced to 2 months behind bars, and he was then charged for theft. So let's skip forward a few years and let's skip to a new era, a new dawn in South Africa, and now we're heading to 1994, where majority of the country and also the world are rejoicing, they are happy, because we have now left the apartheid South Africa, and we are now rejoicing as a nation to the end of apartheid and to the end of oppression for so many of our people.
But little by little, the apartheid establishment crumbled. After gradual reform, Nelson Mandela, in prison since not long after Sharpeville, was set free in 1990. 4 years later, he was elected as South Africa's first black president. Apartheid had ended.
But even though the country was rejoicing, David was not so much. So it was during the year 1994 when David had actually murdered his first victim. And apparently David and his uncle were getting into some type of altercation, and they ended up quite violently arguing, and David ended up stabbing his uncle to death. And David was promptly arrested and he was taken to prison. And when David's trial was done, he was sentenced to 6 years for culpable homicide, but he was only requested to serve 2 out of the 6 years behind bars. The rest of the years he would then serve on a suspended sentence. Oh, before we skip further into the story, it completely slipped my mind, but David, before he actually entered prison, is married to a lady named Takalani Lydia Mmbengwa, and together Takalani and David had 4 children. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page, so David's now in prison and he's serving his 2-year sentence. Then a guy comes to visit David and he's telling David about his home life, how his wife and children are, and then he puts some more information on the table for David to hear about. And apparently he says that Takalani is having an affair with some man, and of course David is really upset to hear this. But the upsetting thing is that he instantaneously believed this man that came to visit him, so he didn't really put much faith in Takalani's fidelity. And remember, David had kind of just gotten into prison, so it was a couple months into his sentence, but basically he was going to sit for the next 2 years, sitting and seething and remembering what this man had said and thinking about this person having an affair with his wife. And of course now the anger was building and building up in David, and he started having real festering hatred towards his wife. But then let's fast forward 2 more years and let's now go to 1996. So David is now released in the beginning of 1996, early weeks of January 1996. So he's now out on the street and we're not quite sure if he actually looked for a job, but with a criminal record, and he did leave school quite early, his opportunities were very slim. So with being at home for a couple of days, he then decided to go and look for more trouble. And David decided now that he was going to target some victims with money, and he decided now that he's going to try and rob victims of money or whatever possessions that they had. So at first, David would use a knife to scare his victims into giving him whatever they had, but then he would move on to using a weapon, and we would get on to how he got hold of this weapon in a few minutes. But before that, let me just put things into perspective here. So like I said, David had just gotten released from prison in January of 1996. By February of 1996, David was now starting his whole robbery spree with a knife. So he really didn't wait very long at all. And on the 16th of February 1996, David came across a man who was walking towards his vehicle named Zachariah. And Zachariah Madura was minding his own business, just about to unlock his vehicle when David came up behind him and stabbed him multiple times in the back. Zachariah then quickly turned around and he obviously was now face to face with David. David then told Zachariah to give him everything he had, and he did. He gave him over 3,000 Rand in cash, his cell phone, his wallet, also the keys to his car, and whatever possessions were in his car. And I think there was like an audio system or some type of sound system within Zachariah's car already. David also got hold of Zachariah's pistol, which was inside the car as well. But later on, David would say how much he loved attacking Zachariah. He would say that the amount of power and the amount of fear that he put in Zachariah was absolutely addictive, and he wanted more of that. So like I did promise, in a few minutes we would have gotten back to how David ended up getting this gun. So because Zachariah had left a pistol or a small gun inside of his vehicle, David now had gotten hold of a gun. So David had thought to himself, okay, cool, now I don't have to use this knife, because a conflict with knife is very kind of intimate. You have to be so close to the person in order to do any harm with a knife. However, now that he has a gun, he can be a couple of meters away. He doesn't even have to look this person in the face. He can shoot them from behind and cause and inflict some real damage. So then, on the 16th of March 1996, a delivery truck, which was en route to delivering bread to a local supermarket, was being driven by a man named Simon Donyana. Simon had come to a stop at a red robot, and David had now seen this truck stopped, and he wanted to take full advantage. So David then sees that Simon's truck has stopped. He then swings open the passenger door and points the gun at Simon. He then shoots Simon a couple of times in his chest area, but Simon puts his foot straight on the pedal and he starts accelerating down the road, and he didn't even stop. David was dislodged from the truck, so Simon ended up escaping with his life, and he did end up surviving. Then around a month later, in April of 1996, David then shot and wounded a man who was just about to leave a restaurant. He had just eaten, so David then decided to shoot him, and he robbed this man of 600 Rand. But in May of 1996, David then sees another delivery vehicle delivering goods to a supermarket, And David had learned from his mistakes the previous time, and he ended up opening the passenger door but getting inside the vehicle and then opening fire to this delivery truck driver. The delivery truck driver's name was Thomas Gandula, and he was only 36 years old at the time, and he was murdered by David on that day. Then another month later, Lawrence Muofe was killed in a robbery by David. Lawrence was robbed of a couple $100, and David just opened fire and shot Lawrence to death. And Lawrence was only 33 years old at the time. So up until this point, in June of 1996, all of the murders and type of robberies had been the same MO, and David would either kill his victims or not kill his victims, with robbery included in this type of MO. And all of the victims would be men. But then later on, David would later confess that all of the robberies and murders in his first type of killings would all be non-forced at all. He said that all of the people who he robbed willingly gave out their money and willingly gave up everything they had, but he took it to the next step and killed them anyway. So experts would kind of gauge that killing was actually the motive for him getting into these trucks or robbing the people, and getting the money or robbing the people was just a kind of bonus for David. So based on this particular MO of David Mmbengwa, he had only killed 2 people. But then David started to move to the creepier side of his murderous mind, and he started heading into a more fantasy type of direction. And later articles and experts would say that David was kind of spurred on to do these fantasy kind of killings by what he had seen as a child and what he had experienced. So then, on the 31st of July 1996, David was busy roaming around the bushy area in Limpopo when he came across a couple that was sitting in the long grass where they were just having some romantic time together, kissing and cuddling. And then the couple then decided to move into taller grass to have some private time. One of the people in this couple, her name was Constance Koza, and she was 54 years old at the time. Her male friend was not named in this case. But when the couple decided to move for the second time, they had heard something, so they were kind of just on the lookout for what they heard in the grass. But then a couple minutes went by, and the couple had noticed now that there was a person walking towards them, and this person's name was David. David then forced Constance and her male companion to then get into their vehicle and then drive into a really isolated area a couple of kilometers away from where they first were. David then ordered Constance and her male friend to then get out of the vehicle and then lie on their tummies in the grass. Constance's male friend would then later say that David was then insinuating to Constance that he's now going to have his way with her, and he started touching her and trying to remove her clothing, when Constance was having absolutely none of it, and she started fighting back when 2 shots rang out and killed Constance almost instantly by David. When Constance's male companion had noticed that she was now dead, he took this as his opportunity, and in that split second, he decided to turn around and run, and David was obviously hot on his tail, and he then shot 2 other shots towards Constance's male friend, but he ended up missing both shots. Her male friend then went to the police station, where he then reported the murders. The police opened up an investigation, but they couldn't link any person to this murder. So because of this, they were unable to trace the perpetrator, and David just went on like nothing else happened. David did, however, figure that because he had let someone go and he assumed that this person was going to go to police, he had to get out of the area. So David decided that it was best to completely move on, and he then headed to the Northwest Province. And because of a lot of DNA and a lot of physical evidence and also witnesses, police had managed to figure out that David was responsible for a lot of the robberies that he did a couple of months prior. And then on the 14th of November, David was then charged and promptly arrested by police because he was found hiding in Brits. And he was arrested for the murder of Thomas Gandula, remember the truck driver who he had killed a couple of months before. But then, while police were busy transporting David, they had managed to arrest David, but it happened quite later in the day. So they were transporting David to another area, and the police had to arrest. It was late in the evening, they were tired, and the police had to stop over in case they fell asleep at the wheel. So they stopped over in a place called Silverton in Pretoria, and they then put David in the Silverton holding cells where they kept him overnight. But while police then went to a hotel to sleep over for the night, David managed to escape. And then David returned to Limpopo, where he then laid low for a little while and a couple of months. But then on the 29th of April 1997, Rendani Rampuga and his girlfriend were also lying in a grassy area. I think they may have been having a picnic or eating something, when just like before, David creeped up upon the couple, but this time he walked straight up to Rendani and he then shot him, and Rendani fell to the floor almost immediately. His girlfriend was just sat there screaming and in absolute shock, and David just turned around and walked away. But then Rendani's girlfriend managed to flag down a passerby in a vehicle. This passerby then pulled Rendani and they took him to a hospital, where sadly he was pronounced dead soon after arriving. David then attacked another couple on the 24th of October 1997, and this man's name was Lecter Magwebu, and he actually worked for the Department of Agriculture at the time. And Lecter and his girlfriend were then headed off to a grassy area, also to have some private time, when David then creeped out from behind a bush somewhere and then attacked the couple. David walked up to Lecter and shot Lecter 15 times, leaving his girlfriend unharmed. Lecter's girlfriend would later say that David was actually wearing a balaclava mask at the time, and apparently this was the only time that David had ever tried to conceal his identity. Then, less than a month after Lecter had been murdered, two police officers were at a funeral. One of the police officers' names were Bernard Nevatalu, who was 46 years old at the time, and this other police officer was unnamed in this case. So like I said, these two police officers had attended a funeral, and at the funeral they actually saw two ladies who both men had previously dated before, and that they both knew. So they kind of wanted to rekindle things, and the two couples then left the funeral and they then went out for a little bit, and then they decided to get a bit more acquainted with each other again. One of the couples then went into a bushy area, and Bernard and his lady named Rebecca then went into an abandoned vehicle. It was kind of like one of those minibus taxis. They went into there with the other couple in the bush. So the couple that went into the bush were almost immediately approached by David, and David just walked up to them, kind of looked at them, and then asked them, do you know that there's a man walking around and murdering couples who are sleeping around in the bush? And the couple just kind of looked at David, kind of dumbstruck by this random man creeping on them, trying to be intimate in the bush. And then he just walked away, and he walked towards the taxi with Bernard and Rebecca in. David then walked up to the taxi, pulled out his gun, and fired 2 shots at Bernard. One of the bullets did ricochet out of Bernard and hit Rebecca, so she had an injury on her arm, but Bernard died almost instantly in the taxi. And David, after just murdering Bernard, just walked off and continued his life. And for the next 2 months, David just walked around trying to find couples to murder, and he did. And David then went on to murder 2 more men within these 2 different couples, and he would just leave the woman unharmed. Then, on the 9th of February, David ended up robbing another man. He took all of his money, but he didn't end up killing this man. But then soon after this robbery, David and his family, his wife Takalani and their 4 children, ended up moving to Joburg. And the reason they moved there was to try and save money. Things were a bit cheaper in Joburg at David's uncle's house, but that's besides the point. But then on the 22nd of April 1998, a man named Norman Ficalipes' car broke down near a cemetery in Joburg, and Norman is an older gentleman, and Norman is quite upset. It's quite late in the evening, his car broke down, he can't go anywhere, and he then sees his Volkswagen Polo driving towards him, and the car flashes their high beams at him, and the car then stops on the side of the road near the cemetery. And I'm sure you can guess who walked outside of this car. It was David. So David walks out the car. He then points his gun straight at this older gentleman named Norman. He then takes Norman's money, and he takes everything that Norman has, and then leaves this older man on the side of the road with no money and completely stranded. Yes, at least he didn't kill him, but before we continue with the case, is it just me, or is David incredibly lucky with how he finds people? And I'm sure that he probably drives for hours and hours, and it's days in between that he's still looked, and these are the only opportunities that he's had. And I mean, what are the odds of finding someone broken down near a cemetery alone, an older man all by himself, and for you to take his money? I guess these things probably happen more often than we realize, but we're not in the mindset of trying to rob or trying to harm the people. But now that my little tangent has gone, let's get back into the case. So then a month after Norman was robbed at the cemetery, David would then commit his last crime at the same cemetery, and it was on the 27th of May 1998 where a murder and robbery detective named Johannes Mokwane had pulled over near the cemetery with his girlfriend to have some alone time. Johannes's girlfriend's name was Doris, so Doris and Johannes were now having some alone time near the cemetery, and of course you can bet who rocks up is infamous David. David then creeped behind the vehicle and shot Johannes and Doris, killing both of them, and David just walked away like just before nothing had ever happened. So the cops back in Limpopo had now kind of figured out that there was a serial killer. They were linking things together and everything was pointing to one person. And the head of the investigations unit in Limpopo had then asked for a serial killer profile to be created. And there's a very good unit within Pretoria who does this. So the Limpopo police then asked the psychology department in Pretoria to create this profile within the police force. So the psychology department within the police force had then arranged for one of their best psychologists and police officers named Tolly Vreegenberg to write this profile and to create this profile for the Limpopo police. Tolly then had also arranged for a task team to be created in order to try and find this particular serial killer. And within this profile, it had come across that Tolly had noticed that this serial killer would most likely be male, come from a lower income background, more of an opportunistic murderer. He was very obsessed with sex, he was very misogynistic, and there were some other traits as well. But basically, this task team that Tolly had created now went to Limpopo, where they then were discussing things with the Limpopo police. And during their discussion, David Mmbengwa's name had come up, and they started talking about how this David man had been charged with murders before in Limpopo with regards to killing the delivery drivers, and how he had escaped. So the police in Limpopo and this task team decided, let's try and figure out if we have any leads on people who said they've seen him or anything like that. So the task team and the police are then heading out to David's apparent last known location within Limpopo. And before they got there, police are all heading out, creeping towards the house. They got their guns drawn and they then bashed down this door. They're then quite disappointed, noticed that the house is completely abandoned, but there was still a lot of stuff within this house that had been left by David and his family, but mostly in one room in particular, which they assumed was David's. And within this room, they found a lot of bullets. They found piles upon piles of pornography. They also found documents documenting how women should behave in a relationship and how men should be superior within the relationship. And they also found some legal papers within this room as well. So police kind of had to go back to the beginning and try and figure out where David could have gone. So the police and the task team then decided to visit David's mom and see if they could get any information from her. And David's mom at first was incredibly reluctant to talk to the police, but eventually they said, like, listen, your son has been or possibly involved in a lot of murders and a lot of robberies. We need to get him off the street. So David's mom then admitted to the police that David and his family were no longer living in Limpopo and that they had actually moved to Joburg to be with David's uncle. So the police and this task team then headed out to Joburg, where they tried to track down David's uncle. David's uncle was not at his particular house. So the police were a little bit annoyed because they had come all this way. They wanted to kind of wrap things up, but David's uncle wasn't there. So they then, the next day, on Tuesday, the 15th of June, 1998, went to David's uncle's work and kind of started talking to David's uncle there and saying, listen, we really need to find your nephew. Please, can you point him out to us? So David's uncle then took them back to the house and he was like, see, he's not here. I didn't have anything to do with this. But then police really sat David's uncle down and said, listen, like, things are really bad. You kind of are an accessory if you are hiding David anyway. So David's uncle was kind of like, okay, I don't want to get involved with this. I'll point out where David is to you. And David's uncle then told the police and the task team that David is hiding out in an informal settlement a couple of kilometers away. So David was pointed out within this informal settlement, and David was quickly found and quickly arrested by this task team and the police. At first, once David was arrested, he was quite standoffish with the police, but one of the officers who was interrogating David had managed to connect with David quite well, and David felt that he could open up to this police officer, which he did, and he then would confess to this police officer everything that he had done, and this confession would take about an hour and a half. David was then put on trial in October of 1999, And the trial was going well for a couple of months, but then, of course, at the end of December is Christmas time, so a lot of people took off and the case was then postponed to January of 2000. But then in January of 2000, there was a massive tropical thunderstorm that happened over Madagascar, which then had made its way to South Africa, and it absolutely devastated our shores and a lot of inland provinces as well. So because of this, David's trial was postponed indefinitely until South Africa could kind of rebuild all the physical damage to the buildings, to hospitals, and to all of that. But then in July of 2001, David's trial began again, and he was found guilty of all 7 charges laid upon him. David was then found guilty of 7 different charges of murder and other charges such as assault and robbery. David was sentenced to 7 life sentences plus another 46 years. So David will definitely spend the rest of his years in prison. And when looking up these cases and reading up upon serial killers within South Africa, there's a lot of hooing and hawing about how many serial killers are in South Africa and it's so dangerous. And yes, South Africa can be a very dangerous country. However, I do believe that our detectives are very good at what they do in some instances, because yes, we may have a lot of killers, but doesn't it also say something for our detectives to be able to actually catch these killers, and so many of them? But I guess you could argue both ways with that, so we're not going to get too much into it. But I think the detectives who worked on David Mbengwa's case were very good and very well organized. Yes, it took a long time, and sadly, a lot of people passed away because of David's actions. However, for our detectives to link these 2 different crimes together, if there was not a lot of evidence and if there was not a lot of witnesses to David's first type of killings with the robberies and murders, then it is a possibility that David would have gotten away with those. But we must give credit where credit's due, and they did very well with apprehending David the second time. This case is also quite similar to the Cedric Marquet case that we covered a couple months before, and I say similar but not the same, because Cedric was incredibly violent, so was David. However, Cedric murdered both men and women, and he also raped the women that he had encountered in these couples. But anyway, I've kept you for long enough, and thank you for sitting with me this far. I hope that you have a great day further and that you are staying safe, and I will see you again next week. Bye!